You're gonna have to identify what this is. This was last week in Harold Park. Did you get it? It was so loud, it was unbelievable. I
Solid frogs.
What?
Solid frogs.
No, wood frogs, sorry. Wood frogs are the ones that you think sound like ducks.
Yeah.
If you walk through these, you'll hear the quack, 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 quack. Those are wood frogs.
And what are wood frogs?
Peepers are the eeny, weeny, they go
Yeah.
louder than that.
Very good.
Yeah. So how many people live within sort of a real easy distance to Harold Parker? Wow, and how many people have never been there? Wow, that's amazing. You've never been there. Well, you'll have to come. Well, you know, you'll have to come on the Wednesday hike. 2 years ago, I hired Bob. He was one of the best finds I've ever had, besides my husband. Don't tell his wife. Anyway, so, and he's a real boon to us. Seasonal jobs are really tough. You have to find a special person with a special life situation who is able to work on a seasonal basis. Bob is basically retired from his former life, and now he's living his sort of retired fantasy life, where he can spend time in the woods and fishing and recreating. And he's been really a wonderful addition to our staff, and I just wish that we could get him on full time, but real life doesn't run that way. So anyway, we're going to cover a little bit about the CCC. I hope that we're not going to keep you too very long. I don't pretend to be an expert about the Civilian Conservation Corps. We are having a celebration May 15th, which is a Saturday, I believe. Am I right about that? At Upton State Forest in Upton, near sort of the Framingham area. That was another one of the CCC built, as many of our forests are, another one of the infrastructures that was built by the CCC. And there will be some of the CCC alumni there. We still have a few around. They're in their late 80s. And of course, they were late enrollees to the CCC. They didn't join actually in 1933. This was an absolutely fantastic program that was started by FDR that we, I'm sure, could never replicate at this time in our history. And we'll be seeing a little bit about how quickly it happened, how, you know, it really put people back to work in a very timely fashion. We think times are bad now. It was really bad then. My father, who is no longer with us, was born in 1920 in rural Nebraska. And I remember, you know, in the late 70s and early 80s when we were having sort of those hard economic times, and they would say, unemployment, you know, whatever it was at the time. I don't really even remember. He said, unemployment. They don't even know what unemployment is. Remembering back to when he was 8, 9 years old, and 25, 30, 40% of the male workforce was not working. That was really hard. And this program that they built was absolutely, it was brilliant. It was fantastic. And we benefit greatly today, almost on a daily basis, from the legacy and the work that these young men put in all over the United States and in many, many, many places in Massachusetts. And I think a lot of people don't even realize, you know, how prevalent the camps were. There were 2 in Harold Parker. There was one in the location where Lorraine Park Campground is right now. That was so-called recreation CCC camp. They had different things that the camps sort of concentrated on. They built Lorraine Park Campground to be a campground in anticipation that it would be there for recreation. Then there was one that was off of Harold Parker Road, and I need to go in there and see if I can find any foundations or anything that remained from that. That was one of their like silviculture, tree forestation camps. And that was a camp that they used for wildlife environment enhancement and the planting of trees. And sadly enough, the CCC was disbanded too soon to really carry out their work in forestry. They planted a lot of red pines and white pines, but then they weren't able to continue the funds to follow up on the proper thinning and forestry practices that they should have. So as a result, now those pines are what, 80 years old, and we're starting to lose them because they really weren't treated properly the way they should have been. The plan was in place, but anyway. So forgive me as I read. I'll try not to be too, we're on TV here. Okay. So this is called the Civilian Conservation Corps in Massachusetts, a legacy of stewardship. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a project developed during the Great Depression as a relief to the environmental and economic distress. Across Massachusetts and across the nation, the CCC forever changed both the land and the people. The improvements the boys made to our forests and parks are here for generations of young people to use, and the experience they gained in the seas has built much more than parks over the years. As we have celebrated the 75th anniversary of the CCC that happened last year, it is clear that its legacy is all around us and is ours to maintain. Today we will show you what the CCC was, that it was a program in the 30s meant to put young men to work and to help the environment. We will show you the conditions during the Great Depression that led to the creation of the CCC, as well as where the men lived and what they did for work, for fun, and for learning. Finally, we'll show you what the boys have left behind for all of us. The 1930s, go ahead. The 1930s was a tumultuous time in American history. Hard times, they called it. Americans had recently been experiencing a bubble of prosperity, a time of low prices and high wages, a time of growing technological opportunities, a time of man versus nature never looked so good. At the same time, however, Americans were ripping through our forests and sod and were unaware of the impending bubble burst. When the environmental and economic crises converged, things were at their worst. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to repair the environment and to help raise America from economic ruin. During the Great Depression, widespread disaster befell America's natural resources. The result of years of constant overworking the land was pervasive soil erosion. Soil freed from the ground was able to blow or wash away. As the soil eroded, the plant composition changed, and water which was once slowed by, absorbed by, and otherwise used by the ground cover was free to wreak havoc on the land and on people's lives. Flooding and droughts occurred at the same time. Free soil was collected by the wind and stripped from the dry, cracked fields in the west and deposited in new patterns across the Midwest. Dust storms became common in the Midwest, as noted by John Steinbeck in The Grapes of Wrath. The wind grew stronger, whisked under stones, carried up straws and old leaves and even little clods, marking its course as it sailed across the fields. The dawn came, but no day. In the gray sky, a red sun appeared, a dim red circle that gave a little light, like dusk. And as that day advanced, the dusk slipped back toward darkness, and the wind cried and whimpered over the fallen corn. All the next day, the dust sifted down from the sky. An even blanket covered the earth. It settled on the corn, piled up on the tops of fence posts, blanketed the weeds and the trees. As an exclamation point on a muffled statement, one storm demonstrated to the world the beleaguered conditions of the Midwest. A dust storm collected soil from the plains of Kansas and then crossed the nation, delivering soil to the streets of Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. It even left a layer of soil on the deck of an ocean liner in the North Atlantic and required Boston street lamps to be lit at noon. Ultimately, the people gave up on the land and moved on. At the same time, the nation was recoiling from the shock of the stock market crash of 1929 and the resulting depression that ensued. The stock market crash didn't cause the Great Depression, but was one of the most evident symptoms of an unhealthy market system. Banks closed, companies folded, savings were depleted or vanished, and widespread unemployment took hold in the streets of our cities and towns. In a limited attempt at relief, various governmental agencies in the states tried to create ways to help. Men trying to support their families found themselves either on the dole or standing in bread lines that sometimes coiled around city blocks. The culture of the day, however, included a stubborn individualist property in which people led to a resistance to the dole. People saw being on the dole as a personal failure and an inability to care for one's family. The federal government during the first few years of the Depression relied on the idea that philanthropy would be the answer to resolving economic hardship, that those who had resources would make the choice to support their fellow citizens at the local level. But many were forced to make hard choices when the plan fell short of providing for the common man. An example of the resistance that people felt to receiving a handout is in the apple sellers. In cities across America, many people became apple sellers, buying apples from a supplier on credit, then selling them to customers in the street. The apple annies, as some were called, could make a fair profit by selling all of their apples. With so many sellers on the streets, even their resourcefulness was often not rewarded. The citizenry largely blamed the administration for not being strong enough to make change. And by elections of November of 1932, people were ready for change. Change came in the form of sweeping social activism in the candidate of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In November of 1932, Roosevelt beat Herbert Hoover in a landslide victory running on the promise of a New Deal. His optimism and enthusiasm lifted the hopes of some, but many more, leery from the experience of the past administration, were waiting for action. In what has come to be known as the first 100 days, FDR enacted hundreds of social and economic programs in an attempt to make change. FDR capitalized on the staunch individualism of Americans and coupled it with social activism. With the blessing of Congress, FDR enacted dozens of programs with colorful and hopeful names, like Works Progress Administration, the Federal Emergency Recovery Administration, the Agricultural Advisement Administration, and of course, the CCC. In one of the first of many public addresses he called his fireside chats with Americans, he laid out his plan for a program that would put hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men to work in the forests and fields of our nation. The CCC would serve two functions: to offer assistance to those who needed it and to improve our worsening environment. Congress supported the idea, and CCC was on the fast track to success.